Hello and welcome to episode 34 of the Zen Business Podcast. My name is Simon Bell, and joining us on the show today is clinical psychologist, author and meditation teacher Malcolm Huxter. Mal has been practicing mindfulness for over 40 years and been teaching it in both clinical and public settings for more than 25. Mal originally learnt these practices from the Buddhist tradition, ordaining as a Buddhist monk in Thailand in his early 20s. Mal's been a psychologist since 1991 and has worked with hundreds of clients using mindfulness, compassion, loving kindness, and a myriad of other scientifically validated techniques to improve well-being. His book, Healing the Heart and Mind with Mindfulness, Ancient Path, Present Moment, is aimed at anyone who wishes to use mindfulness practices for psychological freedom. Mal, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here.
I'm so grateful to have come across your presence online and the work that you've done over the many years of both psychology and Buddhist teachings, which I thought would be a great place to start. I thought we could just have you share a little bit about your background and your work and the combination of Buddhist philosophy and practices with modern science.
Okay, when I say enough, you tell me to stop because I can keep going. I can go for a long time.
Too easy.
Okay, so I first became interested in Buddhism when I was going to art school in Melbourne, Victoria, and I was about 19 years old, and I was sort of suffering a little bit, and I found that Buddhism, I got introduced to Buddhism through Tibetan Buddhism, and at that time I was living in Melbourne and going to art school, and my mind was open to explore all sorts of things. And I was living at a Tibetan Buddhist house called Tara House, and really getting involved in it. And then I went to a talk by a Theravadan Buddhist monk called Prat Kantipalo, who was an English-born monk. I'd been a Buddhist monk for many years, I guess about 10 years at that time. And I really liked what he was talking about, and he started to talk about mindfulness. And I said, well, how can I practice this a lot? How can I really get into this? And he said, you could become a Buddhist monk. So I said, okay, I'll do that. So I decided to go to Thailand, which I did, and I became a Buddhist monk at the age of about 21 by this time. I lived with him for a while and hung out with him for a while, learnt the suttas and became a Buddhist monk in Thailand. And there I stayed for 2 years and sort of immersed myself in that culture, in the culture of the monastic life. I learnt the language and practiced. But there were some things that happened after 2 years. I got quite ill and I needed to return to Australia, so I did. And I won't go into all the personal stories around that, but when I came back to Australia, I needed to have a job. So I decided to become a psychologist. So that's what I did. And I trained as a psychologist and then began working as a psychologist in about 1991, I think, in Dubbo. And I worked on the child and family health team. And what I realised that what I mostly brought to that position was not so much my experience, my training in university, but it was more my life experience. And my life experience, and I was a dad by then. I've got 3 sons now. So by that time, I'd had 3 sons, and I was working as a psychologist, and I was bringing all this understanding about what I did. And much of it was based on my life experience. Much of it was based on what I understood from my own mind, from my meditation practice. And so I stayed in Dubbo for about 3 years. Then I came to Lismore and was an adolescent mental health worker for another 3 years. And then I moved up to adult mental health worker. And then I went back to university, did my master's. I did that part-time. So I've been a clinical psychologist for about 20 years now, nearly 20 years, and a psychologist now for 30 years. and a Buddhist meditation practitioner for about 45. I think I'm 64 now, so I began when I was 19, so it's about 45 years nearly. So I integrate these two approaches. These days I'm a private psychologist. I've worked in London in psychiatric wards. I've worked in community mental health teams in London. I've worked on Christmas Island, and there was a lot of trauma and grief there. And I managed to teach detainees mindfulness and equanimity and loving kindness and all sorts of different practices that were helping them survive that difficult experience of being in detention centres. So the way I join these two is basically by understanding that my overarching framework for understanding freedom from dukkha, which is dukkha is suffering, probably best explained as unsatisfactoriness. There is my overarching paradigm is that of the Buddha's teachings, basically. In particular, in a therapeutic sense, it's the overarching framework of the Eightfold Path, the Buddha's Eightfold Path, which consists of wisdom, ethics, and meditation or cultivation. So the Eightfold Path is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So that's the overarching framework. I won't go into details about that. I can give you papers that I've written and chapters that I've written and books and so on. However, this overarching framework can be a framework for me to understand how all these therapies work in an effort to release people from the bind they are in terms of their suffering. So, we can put cognitive therapy in there, we can put acceptance and commitment therapy in there, we can put compassion-focused therapy in there, we can put a whole range of different approaches, CBT in there, and so on. A whole range of different approaches that conform with this understanding of the Eightfold Path, as far as I can see it. And because I come from that perspective, personally, people are attracted to that. People often call me up because I have an understanding of meditation, how we can apply meditation to it, and so on. So I guess that's a brief summary of my pathway to become a clinical psychologist as well as a Buddhist practitioner and joining those two. And there's a lot we can say about this, but maybe I better stop there before I go on and rave.
Well, there is one point that I do want to drill down on, and that's going to be the focus of our conversation today. And when we caught up earlier, it was one of the first things that we spoke about, and that is the term equanimity and the cultivation of equanimity, which is some of you that are watching the show may have seen that on my shirt. It's one of my favorite words or terms or philosophies. And so the minute we discussed the cultivation of equanimity, I thought that's exactly what I'd love to drill down on today. So, Mel, what is equanimity for those that may have seen the word or heard the word but don't actually understand what it means?
Equanimity, as far as I understand, is this sense of being unshaken by the vicissitudes of life, being unshaken by the ups and downs of things. Sometimes I refer to equanimity to being like bamboo, because bamboo, as you know, is a very strong structure, but it's also very flexible. So it kind of bends in the wind. But in and of itself, it's quite strong. Like I know in Asia, if you ever travel in Asia, you'll see they'll do a lot of scaffolding with bamboo. So
yes,
it's
I have
quite
seen
a strong
that.
but it is also flexible. So equanimity is like that. Sometimes we can think about equanimity like resilience, resilience means bouncing backness, like coming back to center, sort of being strong and resilient is this sense of equanimity. Other ways we could describe it, I could talk about some Pali words. There's some Pali terms for it.
Yeah. Well, tell me why do you feel it's important as a practice to for let's say obviously for our listeners who are mostly entrepreneurs, business leaders, for busy people who experience that stress and anxiety on a regular basis, they're living big lives. Why do you think it's important for them to cultivate equanimity, and maybe what are some of the practices that they could take on to cultivate greater equanimity in their life?
I think equanimity is essential. It's an essential thing. Equanimity sort of balances our perspective. It brings a balanced perspective to life. And in Buddhism, we talk about the 8 worldly winds. You know how I was talking about bamboo is flexing with the wind? Well, there's 8 worldly winds. They're 4 pairs of opposites. These pairs of opposites are praise and blame, loss and gain, pain and pleasure, and fame and disrepute. Another way you can understand fame is like social acceptance and social rejection. So in a corporate sector or in the business world, I'm a small business owner myself. I'm in private practice. I have to put in BAS statements. I have to do all these business things. A lot of the time, it's a lot of admin. I don't have any admin workers. I don't have any receptionists. I just operate by myself. One has to be balanced. One has to accept the fact that it's inevitable we're going to lose things. It's inevitable that not everybody's going to like us. You know, some people are going to blame us for things. It's inevitable that there's going to be some pain in life. Life isn't always successful. It's inevitable that we will fail and we will succeed. You know, there's going to be failures. I think there's a book called, I think there's a talk by Pema Chodron called Fail Again, Fail Better, something like that. Equanimity gives us the capacity to bounce back in these vicissitudes of life. It gives us the sense of centeredness to take the good with the bad, to take the vicissitudes, to understand that it's not the end of all things. It's like, say, we're going through great losses financially. Something better will happen. Something will change. It inevitably changes. Equanimity is essentially a wisdom quality. And there are near and far enemies of equanimity. This is a term that's used in Buddhism, near and far enemies. A far enemy is like its opposite. A near enemy is like a false facsimile. It's like a false representation of this quality. So the far enemies of equanimity are emotionally overreactive or unbalanced or really shaken around or blown around, you know, by the 8 worldly winds, praise and blame, loss and gain, pain, pleasure, and fame and disrepute, sort of kind of really scattered around in that respect, really uncentered. They're the opposite. They're like the far enemy. The near enemies, however, are really interesting. They're a kind of a detached aloofness, a disinterested impartiality, a disengaged superiority. This sense that I'm cool, I'm above this, I'm not attached in any way, I'm not affected by this. You know, I can be, you know, I'm stable, I'm balanced and all this. But in fact, it's just it's a deceptive presentation, it's a facade. It's not really what equanimity is. Interesting, if you come from a framework of understanding the 4 divine abodes, and there's something about, I'll just come back a bit, equanimity from a Buddhist perspective is the result of practice, the result of insight meditation practice actually, or meditation practice. And there's many ways to cultivate it. Insight meditation is one. Insight meditation is the cultivation of insight, basically, or seeing clearly, seeing distinctly, understanding things. So often it's similar. Often it's mindfulness meditation, or the four foundations of mindfulness are considered synonymous with insight meditation. But insight meditation isn't confined to just the four aspects of meditation, four foundations of mindfulness. So insight meditation is one way we can cultivate equanimity. Another way we can cultivate it is with deep concentration. So coming back to these 8 worldly winds and being blown around, when we can have an understanding of life, when we have wisdom, equanimity is the result. When we see the ups and downs of life happening, we don't get shaken around, we just take it in our stride. When we have our failures, we don't take them personally. We don't feel that they are the way we should be or the way we are. We just kind of bounce back. And so these near enemies, both the near enemies and far enemies, are not what equanimity is about. Equanimity is about being centered, stable, resilient, bouncing back, able to take life as it is, and also not take it personally.
Yes.
That's a big one.
Absolutely.
Not taking it personally. Because we tend to take things personally, like someone will say something about us, and it's like we believe them, what they're saying about us to be true. You know, we don't mind the praise. You know, if they say, "Oh, you're the best psychologist I've ever met," I've heard that say. People say that
all the time.
I kind of take it with a pinch of salt, you know, because I know at the next moment someone could say, "Oh, you're the worst psychologist I've ever met," and so I don't try not to take either of those personally, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because the practice of, you know, when you take that feedback, when it's good feedback, you know, as the truth, it's a lot harder than to take the negative feedback as not the truth. And to be able to repel that. So it's a beautiful, and I love that definition or that example of the bamboo, you know, in the wind. I think that's beautiful. Mel, what I would love to dig a little bit deeper on, if that's okay, is the near enemies, because it's the first time that I've heard this, and I think that they would add some value for people to be able to recognize, you know, where there's an absence of equanimity in their day-to-day life.
Yeah. I think I know this near enemy, because when I first went off and became a Buddhist monk, I think I was trying to get away from a lot of suffering and a lot of hassle. I had family problems, and you know, there was quite a bit of suffering back in Australia. I just wanted out. I wanted to get away from it. So, you know, I think part of my travel to Thailand was avoidance, really, you know. And I remember sort of thinking at the time, when I was listening to all the troubles that were happening in Australia, that I was above it all. I was disconnected from it in some respects. I think really I was engaging in the near enemy of equanimity. I was kind of having this sense of superiority, a sense of aloofness. It doesn't affect me. And so I see people sometimes in my practice that demonstrate this. Often they're Buddhists, believe it or not. Sorry, I'll take that back. Sometimes they're Buddhists, and they're kind of rising above it all. One time, for example, I had someone who has been in a relationship for 7 years, and the person had decided to drop them and to break the relationship off. And they came in and saw me, and they said, "Oh, look, I'm okay. I'm risen above it." In fact, they were dissociating from it. They sounded like, "I'm cool. I don't care." It's that kind of not caringness. And clinically, we have something called dissociation. Dissociation is where the connections between behaviors, thoughts, sensations, and knowledge all get kind of split. and cut off from each other. So people are not really connected with reality. It's a coping skill, and sometimes we need it, especially if we have a trauma. We need to dissociate from that trauma to get through. But the healing of that trauma is about re-engaging somehow to actually experience what we're experiencing, to process the events, to allow them to process in our minds. It's called exposure in therapy, but it's being able to re-engage with the emotional affect or the emotionality of that experience so that we can process it and let it go. So often the near enemies are coming out when people aren't willing to engage in something, aren't willing to connect. So, this process of near enemies and far enemies, the way we deal with the far enemies, which are the direct opposites of these qualities, is to cultivate that quality. Like the way we deal with emotional overreactiveness, the way we deal with kind of falling for the eight worldly winds or blown around by the eight worldly winds, is by cultivating equanimity. And I can talk about cultivating equanimity a little bit later. But the way we deal with the near enemies of a particular quality is not by cultivating that quality anymore, but it's by looking towards another quality. And for equanimity, the near enemy of equanimity, what we need to cultivate in particular is compassion. So you think about someone who's sort of cut off, disengaged from feeling what's happening in the world, saying that they're equanimous, but in fact they're just presenting as the near enemy of equanimity. They're kind of retreated into this space of being cut off from the world. They're not engaged. If they can develop some compassion, they can actually open up their sensitivity. They can open up their softness. They can open up their heart to actually feel what it's like to, see suffering from another person's perspective, and also be open to their own suffering, to their own painful emotions.
Yeah. I'm really hearing that. It's that compassion for self as much as it is compassion for others.
Compassion is the antidote for the near enemy of equanimity.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I love it because it really speaks to that the difference between trying to transcend an issue whilst still at some level, believing it's there, believing it to be true, and it still has an influence or an impact over your way of operating, as opposed to acknowledging it and possibly even leaning into it and accepting it and having it disappear in that process.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking of that term called spiritual bypass. Right. I don't know if you've heard of that, spiritual bypass, that term. It's when people need to go into personal issues. Like, this happens to me. I see this all the time. People who choose to go and meditate, they choose to go somewhere off and go to the monasteries or something like that as a way of avoiding something that's happening in their personal lives. And I'm bringing up myself as an example here. I had a lot of stuff going down when I was an adolescent in my home. And I can see back now that I wanted to escape it. I didn't want to face up to it. But that was the only thing I could do at the time. So if I continued to escape it and not look at it, not process it, not go into it, not see it through and understand it, by avoiding it, like going off into the monasteries and pretending not to acknowledge my family, for example, then that's called spiritual bypassing. It's kind of like a loop around it. We think we can fix it up by getting enlightened, and we just go for enlightenment, but the fundamentals haven't been processed yet. So there's a bit of controversy about this. Some people say, well, you don't need to do that stuff. You don't need to go into therapy or anything like that. But from my personal experience, I've noticed that it can actually block progress in meditation. if you've still got some issues from your earlier life that you haven't quite processed, you haven't faced up to, you haven't come to terms with, it becomes a barrier, it becomes an obstacle. So this is what's called spiritual bypassing. And I was only thinking of that when you were talking about what you were saying about being able to come face to face with an issue. In fact, that's one way we define mindfulness. There's many ways of defining mindfulness. One way of describing it is facing up to life, like turning towards experience and looking it in the face, coming face to face with it rather than avoiding it.
Yeah.
Like shifting your attention away from it.
Yeah, beautiful. And I can really hear that that's your access to true spiritual growth and freedom from suffering in that particular area, as well as is transforming it as opposed to transcending it, being able to have it be disappeared and complete, and have that completion piece really take place, to have that integrated experience of life and that level of fulfillment and peace of mind. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
So Mel, what practices, you mentioned insight meditation as an access to cultivating equanimity. Can you maybe run through some of the practices that you go through in Insight Timer, and what some of the things that people can take on a daily basis or throughout their regular lives?
In terms of equanimity or in terms of life in general?
I'd say let's keep on equanimity, and then well, we know that cultivating equanimity is going to make a difference in across all areas of life, really.
Equanimity is a result of practicing insight meditation. So it's the result of meditation. It's what we come to when we practice. And equanimity is also a practice in and of itself.
Yes.
So there's a couple of ways. Like, meditation could be understood as cultivating two qualities. One quality or one aspect is serenity. Another aspect is insight. Now, with all these meditation practices, you will have effort, mindfulness, and concentration. Remember how I mentioned the Eightfold Path?
Yes.
Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Those three factors relate to the meditation component of the Eightfold Path. So meditation could be understood as having those three factors. Concentration, another way of describing it is samadhi, refers to bringing attention into one place, gathering attention, and putting it into one place. So it's a gathering in of attention and placing it in one space. There's a lot we can talk about samadhi. Insight meditation is more about not necessarily one space, but being attentive to a whole range of things. Generally, with serenity meditation, you're just putting it in one space. With insight meditation, you can have a number of objects and you can go backwards and forwards. What you're looking for in insight meditation, usually with mindfulness, is how things change, how the nature of things, the way they change, the way they affect each other. You're looking at something called dependent origination or dependent arising, which is kind of quite a complex principle, but essentially it is looking at cause-effect relationships. So you're looking at how things work, what gives rise to that, how things change, the characteristics of experience, like how everything is impermanent, how everything is interdependent, and how everything is not self or empty of thingness, and how everything that's conditioned is essentially unsatisfactory because it changes. I'm laughing about that, but you've got to have a humorous perspective on it. So insight meditation is that. Insight meditation emphasizes inquiry. Serenity aspects of meditation emphasize absorption. Now, coming back to equanimity. When you pay attention to something, And I'll give you one definition of mindfulness that I've heard, or one description. Mindfulness refers to remembering to bring attention to immediate experience with care and discernment. That's from Bhikkhu Bodhi, by the way. Remembering to bring attention to immediate experience with care and discernment. That puts it in a context, of wisdom and ethics, because you're applying care. Good intentions, meaning care and kindness and intentions of goodwill. And also remembering. Actually, sati, mindfulness, means remembering. So you're remembering to bring attention to things. Whenever you remember to bring attention to things, you start to see the way they are. You develop an understanding of something. Like, for example, if I'm remembering to bring attention to an unhelpful pattern, emotional pattern I have, if I remember to be attentive to it, I'm not taking it personally, seeing it for what it is. It's not self, it's just this event. And I'm not dissociating from it, I'm connecting with it. I start to understand it for what it is. So this leads to wisdom, this leads to insight. And wisdom, equanimity is an aspect of wisdom. We can start to see things as they are. We don't take things personally. We see that everyone is on their own life trajectories. We see the connection between actions and consequences. So we have a sense of matter-of-factness about it. This is another way of understanding equanimity. It's just the way it is. So if someone says something horrible to us, we can see, it's just their thoughts. That's their problem.
Yeah,
actually,
I could really hear the access to then flow state then, because there is that. I sometimes refer to it as that increasing your layer of Teflon as things just slide off.
Slide off.
Yeah.
So coming now to the other way of cultivating equanimity, which is as a serenity meditation practice. Equanimity is a quality of wisdom. And it is also it's what we call one of the 4 divine abodes. And I think I mentioned these earlier. These are divine places to hang out in, like psychological spaces. They are loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, sometimes called empathetic joy, and equanimity. And this is, equanimity sort of balances these heart qualities, and in itself is balancing. But so what we can do is, if we can get some inkling of equanimity somewhere in our hearts, or maybe we can be reminded of someone who is really peaceful, or we can have a moment of peacefulness in our daily life somewhere, or we can nourish it somehow, then we can latch onto it. We can, when I say latch onto it, not in a grasping, clinging way, but like directing our attention to it. Serenity meditation practices is all about where you direct your attention. And I think I mentioned it this morning. There's something by William James, the forefather of psychology. He said something like, what we attend to becomes our reality. So with serenity meditation, you're choosing to pay attention to a particular thing. And with this, if it's equanimity, you choose to pay attention to something that stimulates, or something that reflects this quality of equanimity. As you go into that, you enrich it. You enrich it with somatic experiences, or recollections, or memories, or imagination in some way. And in that way, you're making it stronger. So you're going deeper into this space of equanimity. Then once you're in there, once you've got it sort of running, you begin to absorb into it. I'm talking about the processes of serenity meditation. Serenity meditation is all about absorption into a quality. So you absorb into this quality, and then it becomes you.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Mal, I know you're about to head into 5 weeks of retreat, or 5 or 6 weeks of personal retreat. And we spoke this morning, and, we really hit it off, and the idea of coming on and speaking about equanimity, really resonated and got me excited. And so I appreciate you jumping straight back on a call to actually record the podcast, hours after the pre-production meeting. So I appreciate you giving me and our listeners the time and sharing this wisdom, sharing your wisdom with us.
You're welcome. You're most welcome. It's pleasurable.
Thank you. And I know people will, and I'll put the link in there to Insight Timer if people haven't downloaded Insight Timer before, to use that as a tool or a guide for their meditations, for them to do that, and obviously to find your meditations on there. I'm sure that'll make a massive difference in their lives.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Mal.